What a great pleasure to be here. And especially a great pleasure to be here in this wonderful centre, the European Solidarity Centre, because I know this is a separate conference and the centre is just hosting it, but I think it's a really wonderful place, and I especially like the fact that there is this authentic, actual objects and also modern interpretation. And one of my favourite things in the exhibition, I imagine most of you, if not all of you, have seen the permanent exhibition here. If you've not, I recommend you see it. There's a really lovely bit in the exhibition which has two sets of photographs. One is the propaganda version, and then you can flip it over and you can see the real version of Poland at a particular time. And I really love that way in which the European Solidarity Centre deals with propaganda and communication. And I think it's incredibly important at this time of politics around the world and the nature of what we say to people and what it means. And I just think it's a really super place. So culture, of course, means nothing without people. That's why the centre works very well. But what I wanted to talk about is, when I originally was talking to Marta about coming, she wanted me to talk a little bit about the idea of some kind of conflict between the programme, or kind of the artistic view, and a marketing view, and the potential conflict between those, and are they compatible? And I don't really feel that they are in conflict, so I didn't really want to specifically focus on that. But I am going to bring some of those themes through in this morning's presentation, because there is a trend of thinking about the troublesome audience, that just if only we got rid of the audience, everything would work fine. We could have very nice clean buildings, there'd be nobody complaining, we'd not have to kind of work our socks off to get things done. So that is one idea of the audience. But of course we know that culture means nothing without an audience. It's fundamental, it's connected to the work itself. You can't separate it, I don't think. And I think if you try to separate it, you're doing something very false. You are saying that over here there's a product, and over here there's some promotion, and you have a fixed product, and it's the job of the marketer to go out and sell that product. I think that's quite an old-fashioned view, and I understand where it comes from, but I want to talk about a different way of thinking about things. And of course we know that the audience is made up of real people. Without people, this would just be, I believe, my Polish is terrible, so teatr leśny is, I believe, like forest theatre means, and I was there a few years ago, and it's very, very interesting theatre in that it's in the forest, but also there's a huge gap between the stage and the audience, which I found absolutely remarkable. But of course, without the audience, it's just a kind of a forest. It's just someone standing on stage looking very lonely. And we know that there are all sorts of rules attached to the culture and the way the audience engages with culture. And we've done quite a lot of research into this because, of course, this classically is the reason why many people don't engage with arts and culture. So I was talking, on the way from the airport to the hotel yesterday, I was talking to the driver about audiences in Poland, and he was saying, well, I think the main problem is that people would like to come, but they don't have the time or the money. And this is a classic thing we find to begin with. That's what people will say, but of course, we know very well that people do have time and money. Some people really, really don't have money, and that's a different issue. But people do have time and money. It's a question of what they spend their time and money on. There are other factors at play, and often it's to do with rules. So you can try to break the rules if you like. This is so of course at a pop concert, at a well, it is at a pop concert, rock concert. You might do crowd surfing. You might have the whole kind of, there's a whole kind of thing that's attached to seeing a concert. You wouldn't do it at a classical music concert, I don't think. At the Bristol Old Vic, they tried to break the rules and allow people to break the rules. But of course, what happened was that when people did break the rules, David Glowacki, he was actually thrown out by the audience because when he tried to crowd surf and he tried to sing along with the orchestra. So, in fact, the audience itself enforced the rules around that. It wasn't the venue that forced them out. You're free to behave as you like, and it's comforting to think that you have that freedom, but it's only available to you so long as you behave correctly. And, of course, we know that there are culturally specific rules. Last year, I had the great pleasure of going to the Merry Wives of Windsor at the Gdańsku Shakespeare Theatre, just across town. And it was all totally in Polish, so I didn't understand a word of it, except I do know the play, basically. And I was really amazed because, of course, Shakespeare's an English author originally, and there's a tradition of Shakespeare in Britain, as you can imagine. But in many places outside Britain, they do Shakespeare much better, I would argue. And I think I was really stunned at the Merry Wives of Windsor. It was Promenade, which is how Shakespeare originally liked his theatre. And the thing that really interested me was that people applauded people's speeches, soliloquies. That would never, it would hardly ever happen in an English theatre. But it was a really great thing. It made the whole production come alive. I thought it was, although I didn't understand a word of it, I thought it was one of the best productions of a Shakespeare play I'd seen. And I think that's great that we can break those rules and do things in a different way. So I'm going to show you 3 possible approaches to your audience. First approach would be to pretend that your audience doesn't exist. So this was an approach that goes something like, I'm only interested in putting on art, not on whether or not people come and appreciate it. We know who our audience are, and we know what they like. Marketing is just dumbing down and the lowest common denominator. So, it's a kind of idea that really, as I was saying before, that this is about saying we put on this great art, and it's for you to go out and tell people how great it is. If they come, they come. That's fine. If they don't, they don't. And if they don't appreciate it, then they're, stupid. So this means that, of course, you don't have to take any responsibility. Success or failure is a complete surprise and a mystery, and blame or praise can be attributed to whoever you want: the marketing department, the public, the bad weather, the education system, the lack of funding, etc., etc. Randomly kind of blaming other people. And I know that last night some of you were in the, I think in England we call the fuck-ups session. But someone was telling me there weren't that many examples of fuck-ups given last night, which is great. So either there aren't many failures in Poland, or people are not willing to admit to them, maybe. But, what's interesting about that whole fuck-up thing is, why do those happen? What is it about? Do we know what's happening? And, of course, it's how many cultural organisations operate. Many of you will be familiar with this sort of way of describing the work, with its characteristic visual richness and singular temporalities. It examines complex issues such as the relationship between personal and collective history, the presence of the past and the present, the intertwining memory and forgetfulness, and the porous nature of identity. And of course, that is how many bits of marketing communication material around the world is used. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a terrible way to describe things, but it's a way that only certain section of the population will understand. And other people, not only will they not understand it, but they'll be actively put off by it. So it's about the appropriate things for appropriate people. The second approach to the audience is to tell as many people as possible about what you're doing. And that's actually how that's actually how a lot of us operate. I worked as a marketing manager in a venue and other companies for a while before I did this sort of job. And I spend a lot of time actually telling people, just putting out as many as possible. Increase your mailing list, increase your reach, tell as many people when this event's not selling, tell even more people, and of course when you do that, when you tell even more people, they're even less interested in going because you're forcing something on them. They think it must be pretty rubbish, and then you do a sales promotion, reduce the price, and then people are even less likely to want to come. And that's how we operate. And of course what this means is lots of busy marketing communication officers, working long hours, looking worn out, turning into alcoholics. But then, of course, making innovative use of new techniques and methods and great-looking publicity. And again, success or failure can be a bit of a surprise and a mystery. And again, blame can be attributed to whoever we want. The audience, the director or creator, the bad weather again. Bad weather's a big excuse in Britain. This week, nothing has happened. I mean, you come here and it's much colder here in Gdańsku than in London at the moment, but everything has ground to a complete halt in Britain. It's like we cannot cope with just a little bit of snow and cold. It's just, everything is, nothing is happening at all. So the bad weather, the lack of time, blame the web designer who never does what we want. And again, no changes involved. We can just keep doing the same thing. And to be sure, this can be partially successful. It can be partially successful because we're great communicators and we know what we're doing. And of course, if you do throw out enough information in a relatively good way with good communication, you will pick up people. It's like a scattergun approach. We'll eventually pick up some people. But it also has its problems because it's based on a hit and hope mentality. It's not very efficient. And also the danger is that if you do it not based on knowledge of the audience, it's similar to the approach one where if you don't know who your audience is, you tend to think that they're just like you. So you talk to people like they are you. And of course, most people in the public are not like you. This is a very particular group of people in this room. You are not a random selection of the public. There's a very particular reason why the people here, why we're all here, we come from particular backgrounds. We know certain things. And if we want other people like us to come to our events, of course we can do this. But not everyone is like us. We're a very particular segment of the population. So there can be another way. There's not really any reason for this slide, except I was in Warsaw and filmed this, and I thought I wanted to prove that I could put it on a PowerPoint slide. Is anyone here from that museum? It's a lovely exhibition, actually. And one of the really nice things about that museum is the way in which the interpretation is done. The guides, really great at telling you what's happening in a very friendly, very real sort of human way. Anyway, so the third approach to the audience, which I want to advocate this morning, is that you can understand the audience in order to do our work better. So who are they? Why do they come? Who doesn't come and why? What do they think? How do we improve their appreciation and understanding? What will encourage them to spend more, tell others, work for us? And then, of course, that means that success or failure is not a mystery. Hopefully you'll be successful more often because you are hitting the right people in the right way. You'll be more efficient, get more audience satisfaction, give you ideas. And also, as I said, you don't need to become an alcoholic then. So here's a little example of research leading to a change in action. So the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment was quite a traditional orchestra in London. They play music of the 18th and 19th centuries. Very good, very high quality, high funded, quite high audiences as well. But they had a problem, which is that they felt the same crowd of older people came to see them all the time. So how do they get a different audience, especially a younger audience? So they didn't just jump out and do something randomly. They decided to ask non-attenders why they didn't come. Non-attenders who were interested in music but didn't come to their events. And they said, Well, it's too formal. I don't like going to these concerts because I feel like I have to dress up. It's on at a time when I can't go. This is a real bugbear. I really don't understand often. Well, I do know why events are when they are, because it's often to do with the staff, when staff are available rather than the audience. But this whole thing of like concerts, theatre events, museums always start at the same time, always open at the same time. It's not always how the audience would like that to be. There's no one else like me there. The promotional material doesn't tell me what sort of music it is. I don't know what the rules are. So they decided to make some changes. They decided that with more or less the same program, they would have another set of concerts that happened later on in the evening, informal. The orchestra is there and they talk to the audience. People are allowed to clap between movements, radical. People can clap solos like you would do in a jazz event. There are other surrounding benefits. They make it more like a gig, like a pop concert. And they give a different feel to the promotion as well. So, my clickers, there we go. So, this is what they came up with. They've been running this now for about 5 years. It's been quite successful. It's called the Night Shift. And for example, this concert in Camden. Camden is normally a pop venue. It's normally a place for bands. They put it on a little bit later, not hugely later, but 8:30. It's relatively cheap, £5 to £10. They also have introduced this thing which they don't tell people the exact concerts, the exact music they're going to play. They give people a sense of the music. They say this is a bit like being a pop band. Pop bands don't tell you in advance that they're going to play this record, this record, this record, this record. So why should you do it with classical music? Which is really, really difficult for classical music people because it's all about the fact it's Beethoven's Third Symphony or whatever. So to kind of not tell people what the actual music is quite radical. But people love that because they like the surprise of it. They like the fact it's informal and you go along and you just enjoy the music and you enjoy the atmosphere. And it's been successful. They had a lot of internal problems to begin with because a lot of the orchestra didn't like it. They said, this is not what we trained a conservatoire to do. I think they got over it by reminding the orchestra they might be paid a little bit more at this other section. And they still do the formal concerts as well, so they do both these things. So they kind of try and do some audience development between those as well, between the night shift and the other events. So I think one of the key things here then is about doing research which is also backed up by change. And it doesn't have to be very clever, it doesn't have to be amazing. This is, in Britain, I don't know if you've heard, but apparently Britain is leaving the EU, the whole Brexit thing you might have heard of. But it means there's a bit of an obsession, I think, at the moment with Britain as a kind of an island. And so ships and navies and things are very important. So the Mary Rose Museum in Portsmouth is a great museum, actually. We've been doing some research with them. And we did some research with people who had disabilities, and especially we worked with some people with visual impairments. And they said the problem they had with the Mary Rose exhibition was that it was too dark, and they couldn't see it. And it's too dark because they're old historical things, and you have to have them dark, otherwise they get damaged. So they thought for a while about the Mary Rose Trust about doing this. And eventually what they ended up doing was having special times when the Mary Rose was lit up. Mary Rose Light Up Hour it is. When the lights are on at a certain time, they advertise this. People with visual impairments or others who are interested go to that. So it's kind of a way in which they dealt with that particular issue. Another thing which has become very popular in England is this thing they're called the big screen. So one of the things that cinema promoters wanted to look at was how you encouraged more family audiences to come to the cinema, sort of parent and children coming. And they produced these things called the big screen, which is whereby you have specific films where you're allowed to bring in your children at the same time, and it doesn't matter if your children are screaming, crying, running around, that sort of thing. People tolerate it, apparently. But it's another way in which, no one's changing the film. The film's up there to be seen. No one's changing the art as such, but they're changing the way in which the whole thing is done. So, it's about informed decisions. That's what we'd like to argue for. And a lot of our work at the Audience Agency is based around this idea of having some insight around your audience and then basing it on, and then doing some action. So we have this little motto, understand who your audiences are, discover who they could be. Because our philosophy is that this sort of good work comes from understanding your audiences and understanding them at as deep a level as you possibly can. And actually, a lot of the research we do is quite old-fashioned in the sense that we do a lot of work with surveys. Okay, the surveys these days tend to be often e-surveys or done on tablets and that sort of thing, but we do face-to-face surveys too. We use a lot of ticketing and box office data, which I know is not possible in all places, but it's a very, very useful source. We do a lot of qualitative focus group work, and we do some online analytics using available online analytics and social media measuring. But what we do that's special is the combination of this data. And it's the coming together and being able to know bigger things, comparing with different organisations, different sectors, with what we know about the public in general, the statistics in general. That is where it becomes more interesting. And with the further analysis, we can do some profiling. I'll show you how we do that in a minute. So one of the things we do, I won't go on about this too much because this is a particular system in England, but it's to give you, hopefully to give you the principles of it. What we now do is run a thing called Audience Finder, whereby every funded organisation of Arts Council England, of which there are about 800, come into this system, and they contribute, if they have ticketing data, they contribute to the system, or they produce surveys. And other people can join it as well. It's free at the point of delivery. It's free, more or less. You have to pay for some extras sometimes, but it's free. And it's based on, basically, working to create, the marketing department did this slide, that's why I have to show it. He spent all day doing that. So what it does is it gives you this then. It gives you this big data idea. So we now have on our system the records of 23 million households, which is about half the households in England and Wales. We have something like 2 billion transactions, 2 billion ticketing and survey transactions on the system. And it means that when you get to that sort of level, you get quite a good idea of robustness. It's quite efficient. And what happens then is you can bring it back into people's, so everyone has their own dashboard then. So the data goes into a big warehouse, it's filtered out, comes back to the organisation. So they've got their own data measured against other data, basically. And of course, what it does do then is it gives you some national insights, which is useful for Arts Council England. It's useful for Arts Council making a case to government and about advocacy generally. So I know this varies enormously. We're quite lucky in that we've now managed to work with several box office systems to use the data that comes from box office systems to put into a big sort of cloud data warehouse. And quite a lot of that is to do with, this is non-personalised data, so it's aggregated, so we have to spend a lot of time stripping out the personalised things so that it doesn't confound data protection issues. And we also do surveys. Surveys often, of course, are things which are quite important for people, for example, who don't have the ticketing systems, especially in the UK, this will be museums, it will be outdoor arts and circus, it will be rural touring, it will be live art and site-specific work. Surveys are an incredibly important part of that. And what we do as well is, and I think this is, it sounds very simple, but it's very important. We try and make sure that if people are asking questions that are similar, we actually get them to ask them the same way, with the same responses, so that we make sure we're measuring like things with like. Often when I see the way in which people do surveys, they create their own survey, they think, oh, this is what we want to know how old they are, and they use kind of categories which don't fit into census categories or anything. They ask people how often they go, and they don't use the same numbers. By putting things together, it means that you can get a proper measurement of like for like. It also makes it much easier, and because we know what we're doing, we can also stop people from making stupid mistakes around how they ask the survey questions. So then it comes back onto a dashboard. And the other kind of thing is, I know this varies a lot around Europe, but we can use location to see where people come from. The postcode system is one of the great advantages of working in the UK. But there are places as well which have something similar to the postcode system. Most postcode systems are not small enough to make much of a difference. That's the main problem. But come back onto the dashboard. So every organisation that's funded by Arts Council England can get this for free if they put data in. We say it's a give and gain model. Put data in and get things back. So we benefit as an organisation by getting all this data in and being able to do these big statistics and being able to put that back to the organisations, and then they can get results from it. And you can kind of put some big numbers on those. Some of those big numbers are not always that interesting, but there we are. Okay, and then also with that big data, we start to find some uncomfortable truths. So we know now pretty well what theatre attendance is like in the UK. So we know that about 40% of all the households in England and Wales go to the theatre at some point, at least once every 3 years. But what proportion go, and that sounds quite good, it's nearly half the population, but what proportion go at least twice a year? Well, it's 15%, only twice a year. And people who go to the theatre more than twice a year gets down really small to 3-4%. So, I think it's one of those things with statistics. You often think, wow, all these people going to the theatre, but actually they're not going to the theatre in the sense that we think of it, that they are kind of going every week and know what's going on. And we know from this they often don't remember what they're going to, what they've been to. They're quite old. The highest age category is 65 to 74 years old, so, that's maybe an issue for theatre goers as well. They need more of the Merry Wives of Windsor, I think. And of course, it reminds us of our place in that. Sorry, this is actually a commercial marketing. Sorry, I've got it on that stupid thing. It's the idea that where does it actually fit in everyone's kind of in their mind? What's the actual importance of these things? Anyway, so that's kind of big and blunt, and it's great, and we know that not many people go to the theatre. But actually, what gets more interesting is if you can look at the detail of it. So I'm a great fan of segmentation and profiling. I'm sure you all know what the principles behind segmentation and profiling. But, I always describe it as being a compromise between two positions, between the idea of totally individualized content, where you send something different to which is exactly appropriate for them, and an efficient thing where you send the same thing to everyone, which is cheap but not very efficient in the sense that it's not appropriate to those people. So segmentation is a compromise between those two positions, with groupings of people who have enough in common, enough of that same attitude that it makes it useful to talk to those people and to know about those people. So we've actually devised a kind of a national system, and I know that other people have done this, and you could do this for your own organisation, and I've heard rumours of some systems like this happening in Poland, and looking forward to hearing about that later on in the day. But Audience Spectrum, what we did was we took all that big data, and we then did focus groups and kind of further studies with people from different parts of that data mix, and established a categorization of the whole population into 10 groups of people. These are the audience spectrum types. And it's based roughly on engagement with how often people engage with arts institutions, but also it's attitudinal as well. It's a little bit demographic, but not much. It is mainly about attitudes and actual attendance. So, that's where we get the data from. So this is how it works. These are the 3 highly engaged groups, which are called metroculturals, community land, culture buffs, and experience seekers. And what's interesting is that if you were to look just very bluntly at a database to begin with, and you looked at all your high attenders, you'd think they all they're all the same because they're all going to your events very often. But actually, we know that the metroculturals and community and culture buffs both go very often, but they have very different attitudes to the arts. Metroculturals are much more likely to see contemporary work. They like the new, they like the innovative. They're like the people. They're like us. A lot of them. They're the people we think our audience is, but actually, it's about 3% of the population. Community and culture buffs also regular attenders, but they're like mainstream things. They're much more quality orientated. Experience seekers, high attenders, but they go to lots of different things like sports and kind of active things. They like to try things out. We've got our medium engaged groups, which in audience development terms is often very interesting because they're the people that do go, but not very often. They are 41% of the population, but only 30% of audiences. They tend to need more persuasion. They are much more interested in the whole offer. So the trips and treats are a fascinating group on the right-hand side there. They are groups of people who really the social element of the artistic event is important. That's not to demean the artistic element of it, but the social needs to be there for that to happen. And then we have our lowest engaged groups, which makes up 37% of the population, but only 10% of audiences. So they do attend. They do attend, but just not very often. And we know from our work with some of those groups that the Facebook families are a very interesting group because if you ask them to come to an arts event, they will be put off by the very word of art or culture. But you describe the same event as entertainment or something like that, they will come because they're actively put off by that. And they're a group of people who are certainly wary of other people not being like them in the audience. And then, of course, with that segmentation idea, you might have the same event with different segments in that audience. So it's not just about targeting one group for one event. There are some people who are going to things who want something from the offer and others from other people with a different offer. And in this modern world, the great thing is we can use modern technology to target these people. When I started off doing marketing, it was all about you produce one brochure and you send it out to your whole mailing list, and you can maybe segment it a bit, you can make some guesses. But now with the segmentation we've got possible with social media, with using our e-bulletins, with using our website, we can actually be more targeted. So different groups require different communication, which I think we know this, but it's actually how you actually do it is quite difficult because here we have some typical pen portraits. These are not sort of semi-real people. Metroculturals, trips and treats, community and culture buffs, and I think this is dormitory dependables. It's a family group. They all want a different sort of communication. Here's an example of how this actually works. Cambridge Junction, Arts Centre in Cambridge, puts on it's a real traditional cultural centre in the sense it has everything from club nights to pop music, theatre, comedy, real broad spectrum of things. They really have to try hard to attract all those different audiences. But what we did was we worked with them. We actually did this thing where we tagged their box office, so tagging their CRM system with the different audience spectrum types, which meant that they could then target specific segments with particular pieces of communication. That sounds more complicated than it really is, but I imagine you can do the same we can all do that same sort of thing with a CRM system, whereby if we can divide our system, our database into certain sections, we could then use that to segment this in different ways. So, for example, they identified 2 groups, experience seekers and multiculturals, and this is a piece of print they produced. So, right at the beginning I was saying there's nothing particularly wrong with that piece of writing. Not, you know, it wasn't that it was very pretentious or something. It was just not appropriate for everyone. So this piece of work does emphasise the new. Metrocultures like new things. A world-first piece of theatre. That's a thing that metroculture would like. Commuter land culture bus wouldn't like. Trips and treats wouldn't like that. Experience seekers who like the whole, they're very into the new technology, so they were interested in the virtual reality element of it. And they kind of targeted those. There was slight different wordings between the different groups. And then on the other hand, we've got the junction talking to other groups of people, trips and treats and Facebook families. They were the medium and less engaged groups, if you remember. And giving them different events, entertainment focus, friendly language, and also emphasises the low price. So an important thing about this whole time and pricing, especially price, because price, as many of you know, is much more complicated than people make it out. So some people are very price sensitive, some people are not price sensitive at all, and other people are kind of often can be like reverse price sensitive in the sense that if you make something cheap, they think it's not worth anything, so they don't go. But certain groups are looking out for cheap events, but it's about targeting the right segments with the right information. So beyond the survey, we've been working with, beyond research really, we've been working with the Jewish Museum in London recently, and it's quite a dainty museum. It's not like the one in Warsaw or Berlin. Is someone here from the Warsaw? Poland is this? So anyway, it's a dainty museum, and basically what they're doing is they want to attract a wide range of visitors, to go beyond it being just people who might be Jewish, wanted to go, and selling it purely on that sort of thing, like what's interesting about it in different ways. So they identified experience seekers, lots of people lived in that area around the Jewish Museum, Camden it is, and but not many of them were attending. So we then did focus groups with those people, we identified them, we asked them about it, and they kind of really, they did more than just tell them why they didn't come. They really got stuck into advising the museum about some different ideas, and the museum, to their credit, really got excited about this and turned it into a consultative group as well. So, for example, a couple of years ago, they were doing this exhibition, which was originally titled A Social History of Jewish Tailoring in London. That was the museum's title for it. But working with this consultative group, they turned the title into Moses, Mods, and Mr. Fish, and made it generally much more interesting for those groups of people. And it helped them to get out of a sort of conservative and out-of-date sort of approach to things. So this is what they came up with, Moses, Mods, and Mr. Fish. Mr. Fish, I had to look this up. Mr. Fish is a very important Jewish tailor in London. Was responsible for the development of the mod style, the kippah tie and that sort of thing, which I didn't know. And then they've gone on to, so the other thing they did working with this group was, they then said, well, what other interesting things could we do? And so they've developed this whole exhibition around Amy Winehouse, which has now gone on tour around the world. You might see it somewhere. All came out of this consultative group about doing something a bit more contemporary, a bit more interesting, a bit more relevant to young people. All came out of the focus group. So I think, you know, what I would want to argue is that it's the audience that makes our work come alive. I haven't talked so much here about the whole area of co-creation and co-production. I didn't want to go so much into that area, but that's something we could talk about, of course. The audience are the reason we exist, and then by understanding that audience and understanding them in a deeper way, not just knowing that they're 24 years old and female, you know, or it's about not just the blunt demographics, but what are the attitudes, what's the reason for going, how does that affect what we do, how does it affect our marketing, how does it affect our program, how does it affect the whole way we operate our organisation. I think it prevents elitism. I think there's kind of I think part of the issue around some of the pretension that comes with the arts and culture is that it It's seen by a lot of people as being, being seen, this is being seen as a bourgeois middle class thing. Even when people are being quite radical and, left field, it's still understood as being a middle class thing. But being able to do this sort of work helps us to understand groups that might not be like us, that are not, for all those reasons, are not working in the organisations. So, part of an active democracy. Here we are in the European Solidarity Centre. So we can go to questions in a second, but just to kind of let you know that we do work in Poland a little bit. We're working on the Connect project with the University of Poznan, the real name of which I can never pronounce. Yeah, that's it. Adam and then the other bit. And the city of Warsaw. And this is a project which is looking at audience development from combining practice and academic ideas. So the best parts of critical theory and the best parts of practice. And those working together to kind of advance ideas of audience development. There's also the Edeste project, which has happened in the past. And Warsaw has developed its own version of Edeste, which has become some of you may be running it or know. I think we'll talk about this later on in the day, perhaps. A fantastic example of, I think Poland is really leading many places in Europe around around a lot of these ideas around audience development training, and really very active and practical and real audience development as well. So please get in touch with us about that. That's our contacts. We do work individually across Europe as well, not just on projects, so feel free to get in contact.